Section 26 of the Soul or Rational Psychology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Soul or Rational Psychology by Emanuel Swedenborg. Translated by Frank Sewall, 1837 to 1915, and others. Section 26. 15. Concerning the Animus and the rational mind, Thence. There is nothing more difficult in the science of rational psychology than clearly to understand, and when understood clearly to set forth, what is properly the animus and what is properly the mind, Thence. For the several things which are put into action in our inner sensories appear like a little chaos, whose surface even we cannot distinctly see, still less its parts, one of which adheres to another as in a chain. It may be in some measure compared with the animalcule, which we can hardly reach with the aid of the microscope, from whose motion alone we understand that it is something living, nor do we doubt but that its little viscera are distinctly produced and separate, and that it enjoys a brain, medulla spinalis, lungs, stomach, intestines, muscles, and sensory organs, since the eye has detected this in similar animalcules by the aid of the optic art. But where the sight hardly touches the surface, it is very difficult to divine the interior and more hidden things, and such is the case with our inner sensory. We are able by reflection to discover that we perceive, understand, think, choose, desire, will, are determined to act, and that these are companies of loves, cupidities, desires, pleasures, ends. Since these are all of one sensory, and appear as though continuous and united, it is only with the greatest difficulty that they can be separately evolved, and that the ideas of our own intellect may be distinctly presented to the intellect of another. For who can see in the dark the art of the painter or the beauty of the figure, and who will properly perceive it, even if the painter in the dark explains the figures by his words? Therefore we must await the rising of the sun and of light, in order that all things may be laid open, as it were, to the life. And this is the reason why we are ignorant as to what the mind is and what the animus. It was believed by the ancients, who were not philosophers, that the animus was the same as our soul, wherefore also they said that the animus is immortal. But the philosophers distinguished between the animus and the mind, Thence, and they acknowledged a certain superior animus, which they called the mind, Thence. Some even make mention of a certain superior and purer mind, Thence, also in us. But in order to discover what the one and what the other is, what is their distinction and what their conjunction, we ought ourselves by some untiring reflection and intellectual observation to go into the several operations, and indeed in their order, one after the other, and then after having performed this labour, we ought often to go over the parts again, and so examine by what chain they are held together. For our mind is not constituted differently from the internal form itself of the body, which enables us to know what it is only through operations, only by our anatomically laying bare one part after another and exploring and inspecting it within. Such an anatomy of the mind is also required. Thus we are to be taught what we are from ourselves, and the mind is to be investigated by the mind. For so scientifically does it act from itself, that all the philosophical sciences have gathered hardly more than the least part of a knowledge of it. But let us pass on and inquire, what is the animus and what is the mind? That the animus is not the soul, and is not the same as the rational mind, is most evident from the fact that all those affections and cupidities which are purely animal are ascribed to it, as anger, venereal love, envy, and others, which are not peculiar to the human race, but belong as well to the brute animals. The animus is never called rational, like the mind. All the cupidities of the animus die with us, for after death anger, lust, haughtiness, pride, fear, revenge, and other similar affections do not remain, and without these the animus could not live, because it is of these that it consists. Thus the animus is purely animal, and as it were an inferior or irrational mind. For while the animus is affected and desires, it is not that which thinks, since it is beneath that animus, so to speak, which thinks, and is called rational. Wherefore the cupidities of our animus are to be restrained by a certain higher or rational mind, and to be moderated according to the decision of the judgment of the mind. Moreover, the soul and its every affection is inscribed on the countenance itself, on the tone, the voice, the action, that is to say, on the body, and at the same time the animus has been inscribed on every thing flowing in. Wherefore the animus is so close to the body, that it is in it, and shows itself corporally, as in anger, revenge, haughtiness, hatred, love, and the rest. Moreover, what we think does not shine forth from the face, unless the thought be conjoined with the affection of the animus, except a slight twinkling in the eyes, if they are unable to simulate. From which it clearly appears that the rational mind is most distinct from the animus, but nevertheless so conjoined with it, that we may call our rational mind the superior animus, and the animus the lower mind. But let us take care lest we confound the ideas through similitude of words. But it is asked, what is the animus? If we call the animus the inferior mind, still by this denomination we do not understand what the animus is, so long as what the mind is unknown to us. Therefore we are not thus helped to know what the animus is. If we define the animus as the beginning of the mutations of our body, we acknowledge indeed that there is a beginning, for nothing ought to flow forth except from its beginning. But what the animus is still unknown, for there are infinite beginnings of mutations, and each would have to be explained as to what it is, in order that we might affirm or deny that the animus is such a beginning. If the animus is described as being the form of the material ideas of our common sensory, it will be necessary to explain what form is, what material ideas are, and how their forms are to be conceived of, and lastly, what this common sensory is to which is ascribed the form of ideas. If the animus is called the universal affection of the sensory, or if we say that the affections taken together constitute the animus, nevertheless the question arises, what is it? Where is it? Of what kind is it? For the animus is still to be affected, and not the universal affection. So whichever way we turn, our search still ends in some hidden quality. Thence it results that the animus is believed to be in some crypt of the brain, like the regulus of the eye, or that it is a quality which is without a subject, and that the quality may be some such principle or beginning as that of the mutations of the body. But in order that we may understand what the animus is, we must at least approach its source, for it is not to be doubted that the brain receives all the senses of the external organs, such as touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. For from these several organs the nerves go out, which reach to and enter the medulla oblongata and the brain itself, and that the brain receives the inflowing senses is shown by infinite other phenomena, since when the brain is obstructed, or a nerve entering the brain is obstructed, all sensation perishes at once. Therefore, by common consent, the brain is called the common sensory. This is also an admitted truth, constans veratus, that every nerve is divided into fibres and fibrils, and that each fibre has its own origin. If we follow the fibre to its origin, we see manifestly that it terminates in a certain little head or small globule, which is called the cortical gland. This can even be seen by the aid of the microscope. Therefore, since the sensations which run to the brain cannot subsist midway, but must by all means strive onward to their origins or beginnings, there ought to be in these beginnings that which feels and receives the sense. These beginnings are as many as there are fibres, for such is the abundance and luxuriance that they constitute the whole covering of the mass of the brain, and also occupy its interior. It follows that these glandules taken together are that which is called the common sensory. If we examine this cortex, or this substance, we perceive that all its parts or all its glandules are together disposed into a certain form which is most perfect, and which we call the spiral, and also that these glandules are distinguished from one another, coordinated and subordinated. In a word, that these glandules, which are so many little sensories, constitute the form of the particulars. This much being premised, we may see what the animus is. This cortical brain or common sensory receives, as it is said, all the external sensations, but it also perceives all the single differences which are impressed on the fibres and nipples of the organs. This sensation cannot be called the animus. This is the bare perception of sensations, or of the modes with their differences and discriminations. It is therefore the common sensory which feels and perceives, but not the animus. But still, every simple or compound sensation is a certain form, consisting, it may be, of the discrimination of the slightest touches and forces. Such is the sensation of taste, such the smell, such the hearing, whose forms are distinctly perceived both in song and in the single word, which is thence called the articulated sound. Such is the sensation of sight, for every object or every image is formed from the differences of light and shade, especially the composed image or the object in its totality. This form, while it appears to the common sensory or cortical brain, is not perceived simply as sensation, that is, as being sweet, bitter, pleasant, beautiful, harmonious, or inharmonious, but it also exhilarates and gladdens the brain, or saddens the animus, exactly according to the quality, the perfection and imperfection of its form. This is called the brain's animus which is said to be affected. Thus the animus is not separated from the common sensory. And so far as it is the sensory which is affected, this itself is, as regards the affection, the animus. So the perception is a distinct thing from the affection, and yet both are of the brain. Thus it is the common sensory which is affected pleasantly or unpleasantly, delightfully or undelightfully, whence the sense, and thus the joy, the sadness, or any other passion which is ascribed to the animus alone. Properly it is the joy or the sadness itself which flows forth from that grace, or that harmony, or disharmony, of modes in those things which are felt and perceived, which is called the external affection of the animus, but there is also an internal affection. The animus is also the principle or source of all the changes of its body. For the affection itself of the sensory, or of the single cortical substance, is transfused into the containing fibres, and by those into the whole body which is formed only of fibres. Thus passion is ascribed to the mind, that is affection, as also action, that is, the beginning or source of actions. But because the mind of one is not similar to the mind of another, but what affects one pleasantly affects another unpleasantly, and by the same harmony of sound or form of vision, one is made happy, another made sad, it follows that the state of one sensory is different from that of another, for the affection is according to the state of the sensory. For the same operation upon two dissimilar subjects varies according to the state of the recipient, or of him who is affected. And because the animus is rejoiced, saddened, desires, is made angry, undertakes to do, and thus has life in it, it must be that in the common sensory, and in the particular little sensories, there is that which lives. Hence we must inquire, whence derives the animus, this its essence and its life. That we may still better understand what the animus is, let us speak by examples. What in the taste is soporiferous? This is perceived in the common sensory as something sweet, something bitter, or acid. But this perception does not go farther, and even the pleasure also is in the same sense as though in a certain common taste. But still an appetite is thence excited, and indeed for those things which agree with the state of the body, as in those brutes which from taste alone seek for those things agreeing with their nature, and this faculty of the appetite is what belongs to the animus. Similarly, in the sense of smell, in the sounds of hearing, this appears still more evidently. The modulations of the song and the particular differences of the sounds are perceived by the common sensory, likewise also harmony itself, and grace, of which there is, as it were, a common sensation. But the hilarity and joy and the affections thence arising of every love is something belonging to the animus. Likewise in the objects of sight, the smiling grass plots of the garden, with the particular flowers, roses, and orchids, are perceived by the eye and the common sensory, also the beauty resulting from the orderly arrangement of the plants. But the inmost delights thence arising, love from the view of the beautiful, and revenge, fear, anger from the sight of an enemy, pity at the sight of the miserable, These are of the animus, which is carried away into various affections, thence arising, and from these into desires which are communicated to the body. From these things we see how difficult it is to perceive distinctly what the animus is, and what perception, for there is, as it were, a distinct nature to each. The differences of perception are as many as appear in the sensations, which are innumerable. But the kinds of animus, animi, are as many as are the affections, each of which carries its own special and particular differences. From the comparison itself it may be understood that there is in the animus a certain life which is communicated to the perception of sensation or of the sensory, without which there would be no sensations. Thus the animus is the life of the sensations. But the animus lives not from itself, but from the very soul, which alone lives, and by which all remaining things in the body live. The animus, however, cannot live in the same manner as the soul, for it is far removed therefrom, and it is a more imperfect and composed form, which is that of the common sensory, from whose form the animus derives its being called a form. Therefore we must now inquire, what is that mind which is the form of forms, and may be called the higher animus? It is equally difficult to understand what the mind is, although nothing is more familiar in common talk, and that this word is always appropriately inserted in conversation is an indication that our rational mind knows exactly what it is, but that we are ourselves ignorant. We ought, however, to inquire regarding it as we would ask of an anatomist, what is in the heart and arteries, when we know from the pulse that there is something from which the pulsation comes. If it is not defined by the form of forms, it would be better to say that the mind is the mind, or that there is something which may be expressed by form, by which we mean a quality more hidden than the mind. But if we say that the mind is the principle of all the mutations of the animus, we must explain principle, what it is, where it is, of what nature. For principle is a general word like force and cause, which may be said to be in anything. If the mind is said to be the source of the rational affections, resulting from the harmonies of intellectual or immaterial ideas, as the animus results from ideas not immaterial, something appears to be expressed by which we approach more nearly to a knowledge of the mind. But that may be perceived the source itself must be inquired into, tracing it from its streams and the streams from those things thence derived, which either present themselves before the senses as effects, or have some analogy with sensible things. To explore, therefore, what the mind or the superior animus is, we must proceed in the same way as above in the exploration concerning the animus, that organic substance itself, or we must seek out that internal sensory where the mind, as it were, resides. For that the mind is in the brain is beyond the possibility of a doubt. The state of the mind is the state of the brain. They are so far united that whenever the one is injured, languishes, and seems about to die, the other is equally so. It is to be borne in mind that the senses of the external organs, through the containing fibres, flash even to their beginnings, or to the cortical glandules, and that in these surely ought to reside that principle which is in the senses. This glandule has been frequently shown above to be the brain in its least effigy, and there is in it a medullary and cortical substance similar and analogous to that which is seen in the common brain. Some such little body, therefore, we have called the internal sensory, and we have observed that these little sensories, taken together, constitute the common sensory. If accordingly there is a similar analogous cortical substance in each such little sensory, it follows that that substance taken together is the particular or internal sensory itself, and that its each least cortical part is an intellectory, in which, we will suppose, is the pure intellect, concerning which hereafter. From this idea, by mere comparison and analogy, it may be understood what and of what kind is the superior animus, or the mind. But let us institute the comparative analogy itself. Especially may the sensations of sight be compared with the ideas of imagination or of thought, for they mutually correspond, and by cultivation the images pass over into similar ideas. Thus, in the place of the images of the sight are substituted intellectual ideas, and with these we may proceed in the same manner as with the sensations above, for which we investigated the origin of the animus. So we shall find the mind itself. On the internal sensory itself are impressed as many ideas, as it were immaterial images, if we may use so crude a term, as there are images of the memory and the imagination, which are formed and drawn out by the changes of the state of the sensory. These immaterial or rational ideas are perceived in the pure intellect, or in that most simple or simple cortex, in the same way as the images of the sight are perceived in the common or external sensory. Consequently, the ideas themselves are like so many internal sensations with their differences. The ideas thus understood constitute the mind, but only its intellect or its thought. That good and lovable affection which results from the harmony of these ideas, or from the thought, is that which is said to flow from the mind. Consequently, that which is affected is the mind, and the mind is that life itself which is in the animus, therefore the principle or beginning of its mutations. But still we are ignorant as to what the mind is, for when it is said to be life and a principle, it is rationally conceived as being a certain quality flowing from the form of its intellectory when affected, and thus as nothing nulla without its organic substance. But we may not stop here. Let us go farther. This intellectory of purest cortical substance of the internal sensory can by no means exist and subsist of itself. This ought to consist of substances still more simple, that is, of the most simple of its realm. These most simple substances are what we call the soul, anima, in which there is life, and which is the mind itself of its intellectory, and consequently the life of the mind itself, which nevertheless lies so internally hidden or dwells so deeply within, that it is distant from the animus by several degrees of perfection. From the description of the soul we understand this mind itself, what it is, what its quality is, or what its form and what its principle is. There are therefore a superior mind and an inferior mind, or mind properly so called, which reign in the animated body and which mutually communicate their operations. The mind itself properly so called is spiritual, but the animus is purely natural, and may be called corporeal so far as it is immediately affected by the harmonies of the senses of the body, and flows immediately into the features of the body and into the forms of the actions. This therefore is the reason why some of the ancients called the animus immortal, understanding by this the mind, as may be seen from the proper interpretation of their language. In order, therefore, that the mind properly so called may communicate with the animus, and by the animus with the body, there intervenes a certain mind called the rational, which is our proper mind, which is affected, desires, wishes, and at length determines its desires into acts. Very many have believed that this rational mind is that superior and indeed supreme mind which lives in us, and this latter they seem to confound with thought. But that the case is otherwise plainly appears from those particulars of which we have already treated, and from others which are to follow. For the rational mind itself is not able to derive its essence and its life from itself, but through culture, knowledges, and arts, and in the course of time it becomes such that it can possess more in itself than all the sciences in the universe can ever exhaust. These things it does not derive from that culture and experience, nor can it derive them from itself. There must be certainly a superior mind which flows in, which is pure and spiritual, and possesses in itself all that nature which we ourselves admire as the superior in that mind, and from which we draw forth only a few drops that we may conceive and put forth our theoretical and psychological sciences. But this mind which is called the rational is not properly the mind, for it is intermediate between the mind and the animus, and participates of both, and thus is born of both. For a spiritual mind flows into it from above, and a natural mind, or the animus, from below, which is the reason why it is called rational. For that it may be rational, it ought to participate in both the natural and the spiritual. Thus the more it communicates with the spiritual mind, the more eminently rational, or the more and more spiritual, this mind becomes. But the more it derives from the animus or natural mind, the less rational or more corporeal it is. Accordingly, the superior mind and the animus meet, and conjoined in the internal sensory, they put forth their common progeny. This also appears from the various affections. For while the rational mind is excited by the animus, as by anger, revenge, illicit love, and other affections, it does not immediately come down to take part, but it is withheld by a certain higher and purer mind, and so it is reluctantly led away by the animus into either commanding those things which are opposed to it, or favouring them with its assent. This deliberation and pondering could never exist unless the rational mind were constituted in the midst between two loves which sometimes oppose. It is therefore like the beam of the scales turning whichever way the greater weight draws it. To this mind may be ascribed intellect, that is, thought, also judgment, choice, and will. But intellect cannot otherwise be ascribed to the mind than perception of sensations to the animus. It may be that the mind is the life itself of the intellect, or that thought could not exist and subsist without its mind, that is, without its loves and desires, which not only excite, but vivify its intellect. The mind is, therefore, the life of the thoughts, as the animus is the life of the sensations. End of section 26.